Room 14 was the quietest room in the building. The woman in it never had visitors, never made requests, never complained about the food or the temperature or the thin mattress that had seen better days a decade ago. She simply lay there, day after day, looking at the ceiling with the expression of someone who had stopped expecting anything from the world and had made a quiet peace with that. The staff called her Eleanor. It said so on her chart. Eleanor Marsh, 78 years old, admitted 14 months ago by her son and daughter, who had listed a contact number that went unanswered more often than not. Nobody knew much about Eleanor Marsh. Nobody had thought to ask, until the night nurse on the second floor came back from 2 weeks of vacation, walked down the hall, glanced through the small window of room 14, and stopped completely. She stood there for a long moment. Then she pushed open the door very slowly, as if she was afraid the woman inside might disappear if she moved too fast. She looked at the face on the pillow, and she said, barely above a whisper, "I know who you are. Stay with me." Because what happened after those 4 words shook that town to its foundation. Her name was Grace. Grace Okafor was 34 years old and had been a nurse at Cedarwood Care Facility for 6 years. She was known among the staff for 2 things: her exceptional patience with difficult patients and her complete inability to leave a problem alone once she had noticed it. She had grown up in a small house in rural Georgia with a mother who played the same record every Sunday morning without fail, the same voice, the same song, for 20 years of Sunday morning. A voice Grace would have recognized anywhere, even on a woman lying in a nursing home bed who hadn't spoken above a whisper in 14 months. The woman in room 14 was not Eleanor Marsh. She was Margaret Holloway, and 40 years ago, Margaret Holloway had been one of the most celebrated gospel singers in the American South. A woman the whole world had once known, lying forgotten in a nursing home under a different name. If you're already asking how this happened, stay with me. Hit that like button and keep watching, because the answer to that question is something that will make your blood run cold. Margaret Holloway had recorded 11 albums between 1971 and 1989. She had performed in churches and concert halls from Atlanta to Chicago. She had appeared on television 3 times. She had a voice that people described consistently as the kind that made you believe in something larger than yourself, whether you wanted to or not. She had also, at the height of her career, been a woman of considerable means: record deals, touring income, a catalogue of original songs that continued generating royalties long after she stepped away from performing in 1991. She had stepped away because of her health, a diagnosis that required rest and quiet, and a significant reduction in the pace of her life. She had stepped away, trusting her affairs to the 2 people she trusted most in the world: her son, Gerald, her daughter, Patricia. That trust, it would emerge, had been catastrophically misplaced. Grace did not rush. She understood, instinctively, that what she was looking at required care, that a wrong step could make things worse, that the woman in room 14 had been let down by people she trusted and would need time before she trusted anyone again. She pulled a chair to the side of the bed and sat down. She said, "My mother played your records every Sunday morning for 20 years. I grew up with your voice in that house." The woman on the bed turned her head slowly, her eyes, still sharp, still present, even in a face that had grown gaunt and tired, fixed on Grace with an expression that was equal parts wariness and something that might, with time, become hope. She said nothing. Grace said, "I'm not going to pretend I understand what happened to bring you here, but I'd like to, if you're willing to tell me." A long silence. Then Margaret Holloway, for the first time in 14 months, spoke at full volume. She said, "It's a long story." Grace settled back in her chair. "I have all night," she said. 14 months of silence. And it took one woman who recognized her voice to open the door. Subscribe now, because what Margaret told Grace that night was something that had been buried for years, and what Grace did with it is something nobody in that town expected. The story took 3 nights to tell in full. Gerald and Patricia had taken control of their mother's finances gradually, the way these things always happen. Not in one dramatic moment, but in a series of small steps that each seemed reasonable in isolation. A power of attorney, signed during a period when Margaret's health was at its lowest, and her judgment, she admitted, was not what it should have been. A financial manager, their financial manager, installed to handle the royalty income. A suggestion, gentle at first and then less gentle, that Margaret might be more comfortable somewhere quieter, somewhere with professional care, somewhere she wouldn't have to worry about managing a house. Margaret had resisted. Gerald and Patricia had been patient. And then one morning, a doctor Margaret had never met before had signed a document she was not given time to read, and by the afternoon, she was in a car on her way to Cedarwood, and the house she had lived in for 30 years was listed for sale by the end of the week. The name on her chart, Eleanor Marsh, was not a mistake. It was deliberate, an attempt to make her harder to find, by people who understood very well that their mother had enough presence of mind to find ways to reach the outside world if given the chance. Grace listened to all of it without speaking. When Margaret finished, the room was very quiet. Then Grace said, "How much do you still have in terms of the catalogue, the royalties?" Margaret looked at her steadily. "I don't know," she said. "That's the problem." Grace nodded slowly. "I think," she said carefully, "that we need to find out." She started with public records. The royalty catalogue was registered. The original publishing deals were a matter of public record. The income they generated, ongoing, consistent, substantial, was traceable to accounts that had been quietly redirected over a period of 7 years. She found a lawyer through a legal aid organization 2 counties over, a woman named Diane Prescott, who had spent 20 years handling elder financial abuse cases, and who, when Grace laid out what she had found, sat back in her chair and said, "This is one of the clearest cases I've seen." She filed for an emergency guardianship review within the week. She subpoenaed 7 years of financial records. She contacted the state attorney's office. And she contacted, through channels Grace had not anticipated, 3 music journalists who had spent years wondering what had happened to Margaret Holloway, a lawyer, financial records, 3 journalists, and a woman in room 14 who had been silent for 14 months and was done being silent. Keep watching, because what happened when the story broke is something that town will never forget. The story ran on a Thursday morning. By Friday, it had been picked up nationally. By Saturday, the parking lot of Cedarwood Care Facility had 3 news vans in it, and a crowd of people who had driven from neighboring counties just to stand outside the building where Margaret Holloway had been living under a false name for 14 months. Gerald and Patricia hired lawyers immediately. The lawyers advised them to say nothing publicly. They said nothing publicly. 7 years of redirected royalties, a house sold without consent, a power of attorney obtained under circumstances Diane Prescott described in court as coercive at best and fraudulent at worst. A false name on a nursing home chart, a detail that, when the administrator of Cedarwood was called to account for it, produced a paper trail that led directly to Gerald's signature on the admission forms. The hearing lasted 4 days. Margaret sat at the front of the courtroom in a chair Grace had arranged to be brought from Cedarwood because the wooden benches were hard and Margaret's back had been giving her trouble. She wore a blue dress. She sat very straight. She did not look at her children. The judge restored full legal control of Margaret's affairs on a Friday afternoon. She ordered an immediate forensic audit of the royalty accounts. She referred the matter to the state attorney's office for criminal investigation. And she issued a statement, unprompted, from the bench, that began, "What was done to this woman was not care. It was not protection. It was the deliberate exploitation of a mother by the children she trusted. This court will not treat it as anything less than what it is." The courtroom was very quiet when she finished. Margaret looked straight ahead. Grace, sitting 2 rows behind her, watched the back of that white head and thought about 20 years of Sunday mornings and a voice coming through a small speaker in a small house in rural Georgia, a voice that had made her believe in something larger than herself, still did. Margaret moved back to her own home 3 months later. Not the house that had been sold. That transaction was under legal review and would take time to resolve. A new house, smaller, quieter, with a garden that got the morning light, and a room she immediately designated for a piano. She had not played in 14 months. The first morning in the new house, she sat down at the piano and placed her hands on the keys and stayed there for a very long time without playing. Then she played. Grace heard about it secondhand, from a neighbor who called the legal aid office to report that the woman who had moved in down the street had been playing piano since sunrise and showed no signs of stopping. Grace smiled when she heard that. She thought about calling, decided not to. Margaret knew where to find her. 2 weeks later, a package arrived at the nursing station at Cedarwood. Inside was a vinyl record, one of Margaret's albums, the 3rd one from 1978, the one Grace's mother had played most often on those Sunday mornings. On the inner sleeve, in handwriting that was still strong and precise, were 4 words, "Thank you for asking." Grace took it home. She played it that Sunday morning, just like her mother used to. Margaret had been silent for 14 months. It took one person who recognized her voice and refused to walk away to give it back to her. If this story moved you, leave a comment below. Tell me, would you have stopped at that door? And if you want more stories that will keep you up long after the screen goes dark, subscribe. New story every week. I'll see you in the next one. The financial records said everything that needed to be said.